Okay. Okay, welcome. Is the mic working? You need headphones. You need to find a headphones from your seats. Is the mic working? Can you hear me okay? You can hear me okay? So my panel can hear me. And if you're sitting in a seat and you can't hear, you need to find a seat with headphones and wear them, and then you'll be able to hear us really well. So welcome. My name's Farhana Yamin. I am a lawyer, an activist. I'm here advising the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and I'm also here representing the Climate Justice and Just Transition Donor Collaborative, which is a group of philanthropies that have got together to really start increasing understanding, their own understanding of everyone else's, of just transition and climate justice. As I am a nerdy lawyer and I've been involved in these negotiations for about 30 years, the terms climate justice and just transition were included in the Paris Agreement. I know you all know it very well, in the preamble, which means that just transition of the workforce, the creation of good quality jobs, moving essentially away from the economy that we have currently to a very different economy, is part and parcel of the way in which we're supposed to undertake this now rapid shift towards a fully decarbonized but nature respecting, human rights respecting, climate justice respecting world. So I'm really delighted for this very short panel to welcome you all here and to invite our panelists to give comments, about 3 minutes each at the beginning. I know that's a tough order, and they've all kindly agreed. There's apologies from Richard Lockheed, the Minister of Just Transition from Scotland, Employment, and the Scottish Government. He's been in close contact with someone who's tested positive, so has decided to be cautious and not come in today. In his place, though, we have Jim Ski, who is a professor. In fact, I've known him and he's read his work for many years, and he is representing the Scottish Just Transition Commission. So I'll invite you to kick us off with 3 minutes, and then I'll introduce our other panel members as we go along. Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Okay, thanks very much. And just to say, I chaired Scotland's Just Transition Commission during its first phase, and I've just been reappointed for the second phase of the Just Transition Commission. And just to say, our job is partly to scrutinise the Scottish Government and what Richard Lockhead, the Minister, gets up to. I was looking forward to sitting in the audience and scrutinising him, but unfortunately, I've been put in the hot seat for this. So just to say, I mean, I got a couple of briefs about a minute before this started. And just to say, you know, one of the things about, you know, this is perceived to have worked well so far in Scotland. And what I would flag up is the very good participation in the commission where it went forward. We had trade unions, Richard Hardy sitting in the second row there. We had environmental NGOs, we had business, we had community groups, and a scattering, as you say, just a scattering of academics like myself. And just to flag up, you know, the big conclusions that we came up with for our work, we came up with 24 recommendations in all, but we grouped them thankfully into 4 themes to make it a little easier. And the first theme was about the importance of planning ahead for a just transition, because the experience in Scotland and in other parts of Britain is that unplanned transitions are unjust transitions. So there, you know, going it forward, there will be a just transition planning framework and sectoral just transition plans for Scotland. Second one is the importance of the skills agenda and the question of the movement of people in Scotland, the particular issue of the decline of oil and gas, which will inevitably happen, and how the skills and the competences there can be converted into parts of a net zero economy, which would include things like, for example, decommissioning, offshore wind, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage. These kind of issues would be covered. Third one was the real importance of local engagement in the process. You're getting that multi-level theme, which is the theme of this pavilion, that there needed to be a lot more attention to what was happening at the local authority level, and even below that down to local community levels to move it forward, because that's the experience that people have. And our final one, and quite a tricky one, is the question of who pays and who benefits, and the distribution of costs that come from the transition. So we are concerned, for example, about how people who live in rural communities are affected, those who must use electricity, given that all of the subsidies at the moment are falling on electricity prices, a variety of different issues to make sure that different groups are looked after. So these were the four themes. I must have just about used my time up at this stage, or even got slightly ahead of it.
No, you've got about 20 seconds left, Jim.
Oh, right.
But
so
I was going to also give you a minute, because you only had a minute's preparation.
Oh, okay. So I think, you know, the steps going forward for Scotland, and it was gratifying that the Scottish government said that they accepted all of our recommendations. So that's why we have a Minister for Just Transition. It's why we're going to have a Just Transition planning framework and Just Transition sectoral plans. And furthermore, the Just Transition Commission has been continued with the purpose of looking at these Just Transition plans to see how they actually shape up, to continue with engagement, and just to monitor and evaluate progress with a Just Transition agenda. And that must be by time up by now.
Well, thank you so much for that really succinct and very successful story. And it's a story that's being replicated in many other parts of the world, and cities and regions. So thank you for the Cities and Regions Hub, and to ICLEI as well for convening this event. So in fact, there's so much more going on at different levels of government on this. And I wanted to stress that that's the overarching theme of today. Turning over now to Lee Walters, who's the Deputy Minister for Climate Change in the Welsh Government. Would you mind introducing yourself, if that's okay, in the interest of time?
There's not much else to say.
Yeah, no, you have got. And your responsibilities include many of the things where actually action needs to be accepted by all citizens, by all communities, from the ground up. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts on how you've done that in Wales. Thank you, Minister.
Sure, thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of this discussion. So we say we need to make the right thing to do the easiest thing to do. That is the way to bring people with us in the transition to climate change. But also I think we need to stress that there is an opportunity from it as well. And for communities that are challenged by climate change, we need to paint a picture that change isn't necessarily a bad thing. You know, we've seen during the COVID pandemic, we've had very rapid change. Some of it has been very traumatic. Some of it has shown that there is a better quality of life from changes that we can make. And I think similarly in the climate transition, there's a similar framing that we need to have. It was very interesting this morning that the chief scientist in the UK said that the threat of climate change is greater than the threat of coronavirus. And we need to, I think, take some of the energy from the urgency we've responded to coronavirus and apply that to climate change. So I've been doing a couple of pieces of work, just given the time we have, just to speak something more specific around tree planting, for example. Now in Wales, we're not very good at tree planting. We've done a very poor record of it, and we need to rapidly change that if we can hit the UK Climate Change Committee's targets. We need to increase it by 15-fold. So I think last year we planted 240 hectares. We need to be planting at least 5,000 hectares per year, every year. Now that is clearly a very difficult transition to make. And farmers in particular are seeing that as a threat, particularly land being bought up by greenwashing companies, often from foreign investors, taking over whole farms and planting trees on them. That is being resented and resisted in rural communities. So how do we make rural communities feel this is a change that can benefit them, given the changes we need to see to agriculture? Well, I think, you know, we talk about Wales having a steel economy, previously having a coal economy, and we need to talk about Wales having a wood economy, where we see timber both for biodiversity and carbon sequestration, but also as an economic source. So if we can swap out carbon intensive concrete in house building and replace that with timber, that not only helps us deal with carbon as it grows, it also takes out a bad thing, concrete, from the supply chain. But it also creates an economic opportunity through the jobs it creates, both in the building of the homes, but also in the harnessing of the trees and the whole supply chain. So that's one example, I think, where we can say this is something we absolutely must do to meet our climate change commitments. But how, as we do it, can we bring some benefit to local economies? Another example I would give is around electric buses. We have to transition to decarbonize our electric bus fleet, and we have targets to do that. Now, if we do this in a planned way, if we aggregate demand, as the economists call it, if we pool the orders, we can create enough demand to make this an economic opportunity for Welsh firms. We can build those buses in our own country rather than importing buses from China or from India. And that obviously reduces supply chains and the impact of importing goods, but it also creates an economic opportunity within our communities. So we can say to people, there are jobs to be had here, there are skills to be had here, there are futures in communities from doing the things we know we must do in order to respond to climate change. And there are various examples of that, but I think that framing of not seeing climate change just as a threat or as a bloody nuisance, it could be a positive if it's properly managed and harnessed. But that requires active intervention by the state to stitch those things together and work in partnership with others. But it's doable, and I think it's essential if we're going to put ourselves on the pathway we need to go on.
I'm very grateful that our panel members are being very succinct and making my job as moderator very, very easy. And that's a wonderful way of actually looking at climate action. You know, most of the time in my 30 years, we've looked at it as a costs and benefits. You know, and the cost side of the burden that it imposes has very much been in the forefront. So I'd like to ask now Kelly King, who's holds the council seat for South Maui from Hawaii residency area, to please explain where she sees the planning, maybe from the planning side of things. She's chair of the planning committee and is leading climate action and resilience committee, which she has co-created along with other colleagues. And from my own experience, planning is where a lot of things just get slowed down a lot. And the planning system is not yet ready for an accelerated transition to either housing that is zero housing or for transport changes that we need. So Kelly, please.
Okay, thank you. And actually, I'm not the chair of the planning committee, but I am the chair of the climate action, resilience, and environment committee, which includes a lot of planning. So we do that. I'm very impressed with the foresight that I've heard from my colleagues here on this panel. And I'm going to try to bring us down to a little bit of a micro level of where we're at on the county level. We don't have any cities in Maui County. So we operate like one community of 165,000 people on 3 islands. And so we are heavily dependent on fossil fuels for electricity, and getting into solar panels and wind in a big way. But we also, when we look at the transition to the just transition, because we've been so heavily dependent on tourism, and it's causing people of lower incomes to have to work 2, 3, sometimes 4 jobs just to make a living, because they're, you know, we're asking people to work $12 and $15 an hour jobs just to make a living. And so that's not sustainable. And so as we're exiting that, the over tourism has become obvious with the pandemic, and we're trying to get into more diverse economy that's circular. This is very important. This is where ICLEI has really been helping. We're building a model with ICLEI for Maui County, but it's looking at flexibility. There really needs to be flexibility. For instance, our state energy office was working with the state legislature on these mandates for electric vehicles. And I worked with them on trying to couch that as renewable energy vehicles. We also have biodiesel in our community, and we're using waste cooking oil, but we're getting into agriculture, which gives us the opportunity to do regenerative agriculture, sequester carbon, and advance the the goals of climate action that way. And this gives opportunities for local farmers, for people on the ground to have jobs and have processing, be part of the processing, be part of the usage, because we have vehicles that are going to be around for another 30 years that are diesel vehicles. And the electric economy and the wind economy does not provide those jobs, because windmills are brought in by other corporations onto the island. We don't make electric panels. We'll never make electric cars on the island. So that as we transition into a just economy, we have to look at how we're affecting our next generation, how we're providing jobs. We're working on affordable housing, and there's been a big demand for housing, saying that this is why our young people are leaving, because they can't find housing. It's not just that. Our young people cannot find careers and just gainful employment on the island that doesn't cause them to have to work 2 or 3 jobs. So we're also working on career pathways, expanding into technology, renewable energy, the health sector, the film sector, and agriculture is a big part of that. We're flipping the amount of money that we have invested in tourism into agriculture to help local farmers. We're working on the water war issues, where the big ag has been fighting with the local taro farmers and trying to support local farmers and stop the diversion of water that's been happening for decades and decades. And so part of it is boots on the ground. I think knowing who's suffering, who's the most vulnerable, who feels disconnected from the advancement into the next economy. And that's where, we have felt so much support from ICLEI because of the focus on multi-level. And just hearing, my colleagues talk about how things are going to be on the ground, I think it's also important to go out and do surveys and find out what people want to do, and, because we want to keep our young people in the islands. We don't want them. My own son went off and got a degree, came back, and now he's back on the West Coast in Silicon Valley because he can't find a job in Maui County to do what he wants to do. So I really appreciate this focus on the just transition and hearing what's happening at a higher level, and how there's still concern at the level that where I reside and expect to be, because when being on the county council to me is something I'm doing for now, and it's a transition for me as well. It's not my career pathway. I don't really want to be a politician the rest of my life. You get more done, I think, when you don't want that, when that's not your goal. So anyway, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. I think as it's Gender Day, I want to applaud the fact that you stood for office. I was saying, as it's Gender Day today here at the COP, I want to applaud the fact that you stood for office. We're a long, long way from having women in equal positions of power throughout our political systems, whether it's local officials all the way to here at the COP. So thank you, and stick at it. So, get stuff done, please. Our final panelist is Robert Pollock. He's a senior advisor to the EU coal regions in transition. You've got a lot on your hands, Robert, as the world is demanding, and some regions are resisting, some countries are resisting powering past coal. So please tell us how you found what you're finding and
okay.
Yeah,
just a few reflections on the Coal Regions in Transition initiative first. There are still 250,000 jobs in the European Union connected directly or indirectly to coal mining. It's still a very significant part of the European economy. And we're working with 35 regions across the European Union. Now, these regions are very diverse. They can't be easily generalized. Some of the regions are quite rural in nature. Some are quite urbanized. Others are quite mono-industrial. That is the only thing in town, the coal mining and the coal power plant. And some have got quite diversified economies like Asturias and Silesia. So it's dangerous to generalize about the challenges. However, what we're trying to achieve is both energy transition and economic diversification in an equitable manner. And although I said that there was very little in common and it's dangerous to generalize, there is one thing I would like to emphasize about these regions. They contributed to national development and regional development for decades, if not centuries, and it would be wrong to abandon them. The other thing that I would like to emphasize is, what does it say to other sectors if we abandon coal? There is a conveyor belt of other sectors: oil and gas, automotive. Therefore, we have to be very proactive in how we deal with the coal communities, because they are effectively, to use the old analogy, the canary in the coal mine. We have to show that we are sincere and genuine about just transition. I also think that just standing back and reflecting on the discussions this week, transition is, and a just transition is going to be a huge test for the social contract. If we get just transition right, it will be an incredible shot in the arm for the social contract. It will be a reimagining of the social contract. If we get just transition wrong in terms of the coal sector, oil and gas sector, automotive sector, it will bring even further cynicism towards the nature of democracy in the European Union, to put it bluntly. So there are much more fundamental philosophical questions than just industrial questions. One of the things that really I was impressed about earlier in the week was there was a lot of discussion about silos and how we have to overcome silos. And I think that is a big message for government, because we are talking about working across different layers of government. And there has to be better working between the levels of government, both vertically, but also horizontally. And I do think this is an opportunity for us to reimagine what is government. And we have to perhaps go towards a model of systems thinking. Now, there was some talk earlier this week about targets. Now, targets are all fine and well, but targets only get you so far. And I think we actually need to reimagine government in order that we achieve these targets that we are putting forward over the last week or so. And my final point is that it really is a collaborative effort, transition of not just the public sector and the private sector, but civil society. And one of the things which I've been impressed by over the last 3 years of working in coal communities is the vital role of NGOs as not just critiques of a process, but actually partners in a process. So I'll just leave it there.
Well, thank you, Robert, so much. Thank you, all of you. And I love that you're seeing this as a challenge, essentially, for how we think about government. What is the role of citizens? What is the role of all these different layers, from the EU to the county level to regions, and a country like Scotland, which is pioneering. I think all of you are, in some ways, are pioneering, from surveys to participatory mechanisms. So I'd like to ask each of you to take another minute or two to say, how can international cooperation, how can the COP level, this space that we have here, how can we advance our agendas to involve people, take people with us, especially in these difficult sectors? Well, they're difficult only because we haven't been able to make progress on them. They're not difficult per se. So maybe ask Jim to answer that question.
Yeah, maybe the first thing to say is we need to be very careful about generalization, as has just been said, because each region, each locality has its specificity that you need to take into account. But I think we can share lessons about broad approaches, about participation, about drawing people together, about the way that consultations take place. And one thing that we have been quite careful to do, and I'm personally conscious of, is the phrase "leave no one behind," because I'm a little bit uncomfortable about it, because it implies a kind of being patronizing and pulling people behind you. And the message is that you really need to get people engaged and feel an ownership of the process at all levels. I should say that one thing we might need to learn is where we are at different stages, because we've just heard about the coal industries. In Scotland, the coal industry is in the rear view mirror because the last coal-fired power plant closed 5 years ago. We're now on the oil and gas agenda part of it, and it's really to the forefront of the thinking. And I think passing lessons along there, I think will be very helpful.
These are really difficult issues, and I think we should acknowledge that. This is hard. So a couple of things in response to some of the other questions. So we still have a steel industry, we still have a coal mine. I got into political difficulties last week because I suggested that we need to end the license of our existing coal mine. And there was a strong reaction from the community because there are 170 jobs involved in an area where there aren't any other jobs. Now, I think a couple of things thinking about that is, change is always impossible to imagine when you're in the middle of it. There have been big changes made in society that for the people involved at that time, they can't see anything other than they're currently doing. And of course, change is just not coming from climate. Change is coming from technological change as well. The fourth industrial revolution, the onset of artificial intelligence is also hitting people for six. And I think on the point made about democracy, I think is a very, very striking point, because one of the reasons why the UK and Wales has left the European Union, in my view, which I regret deeply, is that a sense that people didn't feel in control of their lives. And I think it's a consequence of globalization. And so suddenly, if somebody comes along and presents you with a simple solution of how things can be better, and it's their fault, democracy remains very fragile to these forces of populism, I think, in the times of great uncertainty. And there are political forces that will exploit that. So, that's also in the mix. So there's a degree to which those in the moment find it hard to change, and all levels of leadership need to paint a picture of a better tomorrow that is possible. So that, I think the framing of it being positive, as was mentioned, is very important. I've just had a meeting with the Farmers Union now, and I also got into trouble this week about comments I made about eating less meat. And the science is very clear on that. People don't want to hear it. Farmers in particular don't want to hear it because they feel threatened. Again, they feel there are other forces hurting their livelihoods. And this is the latest, the elites who don't understand their way of life and have got it in for them. And the same on tree planting. And I think we just need to confront that. Politicians generally shy away from conflict because it's uncomfortable and it means fewer people can vote for you. But actually, what I think is needed now more than ever is leadership and courage. Because the science is terrifying. And I know all the climate change experts tell us, don't terrify people, don't talk about scary things. But I think we need a little bit of terror in this conversation, because the idea that we can do nothing and bob along as we have is a fallacy. And it's a dangerous one, a seductive one, but a misleading one. And I think leaders have to lead and do both things, confront the here and the now, and point out the change has to come. And that means some people stopping doing what they're doing. That is hard, but that has to be equaled by a vision of how things can be different, and then helping people to do that. And just one brief final thing about the international element, because we also have a responsibility as those of us who were part of the first industrial revolution, and absolutely take the point about coal communities being left behind, and I am from and represent the coal community that's been left behind, recognize that. But we also recognize the impact our behavior has on developing countries, and we need to play a role there. So what we're doing in Wales, a small example just to pass it on, for every child that is born in Wales, we plant a tree in Wales and we plant a tree in Africa. And we work closely with an NGO. It's called The Size of Wales. You might have heard through disaster reporting through the years, if there's an earthquake, people say an area, the size of Wales has been hit by this earthquake. It's become an international journalists' tool of metrics. So this charity, calling itself The Size of Wales, has tried to make that into a positive, and is now preserving rainforests twice the size of Wales. Started off with the objective to save one the size of Wales, has now exceeded that, and is now doing twice the size of Wales, and we're supporting that effort too. So we need to show that leadership internationally as well as domestically.
Okay, beginning to take that off before I start talking. I want to talk about the circular economy a little bit more, and how it's very important to support small business, because that's where the heart of the community is. And I love Obama, but one of the big mistakes that was made at the beginning of his first term was this program called ARPA-E, where there were millions of dollars that were going out, but they went out to big business, companies like General Electric and Monsanto. And after a couple of years, they realized they hadn't created the number of jobs that they expected to. So they started doing a series of meetings around each state. They did 7 in Hawaii through the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture. And just talking to our one representative that we have in our state, one of the things that they didn't realize is when you give it to big business, when you give money to big business, they move people around and they have people sitting around that they can put projects on to. And small business, we work lean and mean. And if you give us $2 million, we're going to hire a bunch of people to do that project. We're going to make those jobs happen. It's a lot more effort to do to give out money to 50 companies and give them 2 million a piece than it is to give it out to one company at 100 million. But you're not going to create that level of jobs. So it's very important to look at what's happening on the ground, what types of jobs. And the other thing I wanted to mention was that I'm part of the, my husband and I founded Pacific Biodiesel, which is now the oldest biodiesel company in America. But we've always stayed with the theme of community-based. So we built biodiesel plants across America for other, for clients who then owned and operated them. And we watched the biodiesel industry start growing to the point where other corporations are coming in and taking it over. And there was a big pride in, well, we're going to be the Exxon of biodiesel. The beauty of biodiesel is that you can start a small company with, not $100 million worth of investment, but in your community, and you can create fuel for your community out of waste oil, out of agriculture that you can farm regeneratively. And we're farming carbon neutral. What we want to get to carbon negative. So looking at what it takes a lot more energy to create models like that, but they're sustainable. It takes less energy to create corporate models that you can spread across the country just like that, but it's not sustainable and it doesn't support the same number of jobs. It doesn't keep our young people in our community and contributing to the circular economy and the new green economy.
Thank you, Kelly. Right, quick response to international cooperation, but I'm going to start with David Bowie and Ziggy Stardust. When I was a kid, I used to listen to the album Ziggy Stardust in my bedroom, and the opening track is 5 years. And it's the speculation that the Earth's only got 5 years to survive. And I remember thinking as a teenager, wouldn't that be a terrible situation? And it's very unlikely. And lo and behold, we're now in that sort of temporal context. It's kind of very scary. So in terms of international cooperation, we've got to move fast. And we've also got to work together. Actually, I was talking about silos. We need to lower our territorial silos. I was just off a call. I thought I was going to be late. I'm just off a call with India, a discussion about coal phase out in India. And, the important thing is I learned more from that call than I actually gave about circular economy, about building social capacity. So there's a lot to be done for the developing world or for the global north to learn from the global south. So I think we really have to reimagine international collaboration. And we've got to move fast. And we saw what can be done with COVID-19, with vaccines, if there really is a genuine commitment by the public sector and private sector to get things done. And that's the sort of timescale we have to start working on. So just a few other thoughts on global collaboration. I think this is a real opportunity to reimagine government. The local, the regional, the national, and the transnational. Let's use this as an opportunity, as I said, for systems change, not for tinkering, not for target setting. As I said, targets are not the solution in themselves. There's Goodhart's law. Targets actually distort behavior. The Soviet Union had lots of targets. It's not here today. So let's not get overly obsessed by targets. Let's get obsessed by implementation. And that's where international collaboration comes to the fore. I also think we have to recognize that low-income countries have unique circumstances in regard to coal phase-out. So 80% of coal consumption is in low and middle-income economies. They need extra help, or our efforts in the European Union are not that significant, if I can be so blunt. They have unique circumstances. They need extra support. I could go into the various issues about they've got a much more modern coal power plant fleet than in Europe, etc. So there's huge compensation and phase out issues, but I'll leave that for another day. I think international collaboration is good for naming and shaming, but I'll leave it there because I can see I'm getting the shepherd's crook.
Well, I wish we had longer. I feel like the 45 minutes we've had here, maybe short of that actually, should be replicated in the negotiations, in the work of all of the different bodies. Especially there's a committee that we set up after the COP in Katowice, where we had the adoption of the Silesia Declaration, But much of the effort of this process has been around a transition essentially for the coal, gas and oil sector, and by and large the workers in that sector. How everyone else is involved has been a very recent addition and a very small addition to that agenda, making essentially just transition about how people, how local communities, how the micro frameworks of support are handled is still not what is being heard or talked about in the COP. There's so much more exciting work happening on just transition in countries like India, in countries like Nigeria, and we're not hearing about that. We're not hearing about that because, as I said, the debate here is quite locked in a certain kind of logic of its own, and that tends to get reported. My sort of takeaways really from what you're saying, all of you, is that we need to reinvent our governance from the bottom up, involving everyone. When you involve everyone, you get better solutions, more equitable solutions, more efficient solutions, solutions that can be faster, where you don't have to have the sticks and the carrots because you have buy-in and you have support. And a lot of that is through the new ways in which, whether it's a commission that's involving workers, employers, employees, unions, whether it's in where I live in Camden, 260,000 people, we have had a citizens panel, a citizens assembly, for the first time, a random selection of people living in Camden deciding what should be done for climate action, whether you have juries. All of these techniques are essentially new ways of doing democracy, new ways of doing decision making. There are many other cities that are trialing participatory budgets, of allowing citizens to decide how the money gets spent. And again, they're having far more success in the way transport, housing, access to green spaces, food production locally happens. So I think there's so much more learning to be done, so much more best practice to happen. And I guess in my nerdy sort of, I'm also a professor looking at this area, you know, as a point of view of governance. There is a big mistake in handing out money, big money, to big actors, thinking that's what creates big impact. That's not the case when you really study, you know, the impacts that we care about, which is good jobs, community resilience, and the literature and the evidence that's coming out is actually smaller scale money spent locally, spent on community enhancement, community empowerment, gets you much bigger, longer term, but you know, benefits. And I think that's the lesson that we're sort of learning, which is the opposite. So instead of trying to reduce transaction costs by giving out large sums of money, we're sort of exploring ideas about something called flow funding, cash grants, and micro granting. So the number of people involved is bigger, and that seems to be a way out of some of the dilemmas, some of the problems, some of the difficulties that we've had. I think we're sort of out of time, but I would love you all to have 1 minute, if you would like, to have your... Oh, we can go until 4. Oh, great. Is that okay? Thank you. So you have a reprieve, and I would love you to all offer some additional insights really about how the joining up process can work better. As I said, I live and work in Camden, and the debate, you know, is always, we don't have enough resources, we don't have enough powers, whether it's at the level of Camden or London. You know, the national government has to give us more resources and powers. So how do we get out of that circle, and how do we actually move forward?
Yeah.
to
Could I just give one other insight that we were strongly emphasized? The world is full of inequalities at the moment, and COVID has made these inequalities worse. And what we've been looking for is the way that just transition can provide an opportunity to deal with existing inequalities, as well as avoiding new inequalities that like emerge in the future. And specifically, we picked out energy poverty which is an issue in Scotland. And that emphasised that we were looking at the demand side of the economy as well as the supply side. We picked up fair work, and we note that Jeff Bezos was here making a speech, and along at the Amazon Regional Distribution Centre in Dunfermline, which Richard knows all about, the working conditions are a little bit different there. And finally, we picked up the question of land tenure as an issue. And this touches on the farmers issue, because we're hearing examples at the moment of farmers. There's a very concentrated land ownership in Scotland with tenant farming. And so we can hear stories of tenant farmers having their tenancies terminated so the underlying landowner can plant trees. And this, we had the Highland clearances in Scotland in previous centuries, and the phrase climate clearances is beginning to come up a little. And there are ways of dealing with that we need to think about. So how we deal with existing inequalities, I think, would be a message I'd like to get across.
Yeah, and just to develop that theme, really, there's an example we have in Wales of farmers who have come together themselves to take control. So it's a community of farmers who are planting on unproductive land, so steep bracken slopes. So it's not displacing food production. So it removes a threat from farmers who feel their way of life and their livelihood is at stake. But also then what they're doing is they're pooling their carbon credits and selling the carbon credits to create a revenue stream for farmers. So an alternative income source, as well as continuing their traditional method of farming. And I think it's quite an inspirational model. It's called Stump Up for Trees project. They have a website, Stump Up for Trees, and we're looking to see if we can scale that and replicate that in other parts of Wales. But on the other point, on small businesses and the point about changing governance models, one of the things we've been looking at as well is what we're calling the foundational economy. So this is an international movement of cities and regions. Barcelona, for example, is one. Preston, the north of England, another celebrated one, where we focus instead on the shiny and the new and the automotive or the life sciences, but on the things that are there because people are there. When you think about the communities, really coal communities, who are communities who have grown up around a primary source of manufacture that is no longer there, they lose their sense of purpose economically. But actually, because people are there, there's still a lot of anchor institutions there. And I know there's some work going on in Scotland on this too. So you think about your hospital, your college, your council services, your some main employers, they're not going anywhere. And how can we better use through procurement, stop that money leaking out of an area to try and keep the value in? And there's some really good examples of how without increasing spend, they're making the existing spend work smarter for those communities. And that's part of the just transition as well. And as part of that is a move away from the monolithic safety first procurement lawyered approach to public spending into a more of an experimental approach. And I think this is part of the change in governance we need to look at, because this idea that the future is set and we look in 5 or 10 year cycles is clearly nonsense in a climate context where change is rapid and unexpected. And we need to move to a far more nimble approach to public policy development. So we've, with a very modest set of investment of £4.5 million, funded 50 different experiments, trials in different types of public policy. And we've said some of these will fail, and that's okay. As long as we learn from it, it's okay to fail because we're dealing with uncertainty. So one of them, for example, is working with local schools, hospitals, employers to get local food served on local plates. So school food sourced from within the regional footprint rather than imported. Similarly, milk from local farmers for local schools rather than the low cost. And we've got this low cost model, which does not look at the true social value of a procurement. So we've done this in a number of different areas where we are trialing and looking whether or not something is scalable. And that's the hard bit, is how do you scale good practice? And that's, we haven't cracked that bit yet. But I think as part of that changing looking of governance, it's about culture as well as about structure.
Thank you. I'm going to just build on what you said a little bit about cost benefits, because I'm a big fan of cost benefits and looking at, and we started looking into that with the biodiesel, like maybe it costs 20 cents more, but all the jobs are local. If you look at the fact that we're making 1% of the fuel for the state of Hawaii and we have 100 jobs, The petroleum industry is making 90% of the fuel for the state of Hawaii, and it has only 350 jobs. So can you imagine if we expanded to locally grown and produced fuel, how many green jobs we could supply? And also I wanted to say education and outreach is the way we're going to turn people into different practices. And if you look at I had so many people run up to me and after the film Kiss the Ground came out and say, oh my God, you got to see that film, because they took a traditional farmer who was using pesticides, who was tilling the earth, showed him how to do no-till farming, showed him how to film without herbicides and pesticides, and he actually had a higher production. So that kind of modeling is how we're going to collaborate across countries, across states, and learn from each other, because there's nothing like seeing, show me how it works. And then the final thing I wanted to say is about big business. When we first got into the biodiesel industry, we thought, what could be better than taking your old cooking oil, making it into fuel, using it in your community, and it's renewable. And it was at that time 88% greenhouse gas reduction, because it was from used cooking oil, not agriculture. But it didn't catch on. And my husband was scratching his head. I'm kind of into the marketing side of things. He's the technology guy. And he's like, why is it everybody just jumping on this? Why you can make money at this? And I said, because it's not the same people making the money, because that's what's keeping us down. It's the corporations and the petroleum industry that's not going to make the money. So, I kind of developed this idea of telling people what we're really working for is everybody making a living instead of a few people making a killing. Because that is really what's holding us back, is that idea that those are the ones that want to make the money. So I want to end there, and I want to just say that I just really appreciate this panel.
Thank you, Kelly. I actually just want to build on what Lee finished on, the point Lee finished on. In government, it's not just about structure, it's about culture. And one of the things which I would love to see is some kind of government academy, an academy for training public servants, both from the global north and the global south, for just transition. And I think it would be an incredibly rich experience for the public sector, public servants involved. There's a lot of plans for transition swirling around in Europe. And I'm delighted to say there's some serious money now towards transition in Europe. So the Just Transition Fund recognizes is providing 17.5 billion euros for transition, which is no mean sum, which is terrific. But we're still trapped with the same old instruments, the same old behaviors and cultures. And we are actually going to have to reimagine government very rapidly. I sometimes feel, and this is when I've worked in many ministries, I work across regions, we've all got screwdrivers when we really need Swiss Army knives. And we're just going to have to start purchasing Swiss Army knives pretty soon. And I think a Just Transition Academy could be very powerful. My last point, given we're in the city of Glasgow, and the song of Celtic Football Club is "You'll Never Walk Alone." This is about solidarity. And I've got to say, when I go to coal regions and coal communities, it's a very lonely place. It's a place filled with anxiety and trepidation about the future. We've actually brought the coal regions of Europe together into a platform, and that has actually produced things we just didn't imagine 3 years ago in terms of solidarity and belief in a future. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you so much. Well, I don't know if you want to sing that song, but it could be something that this whole COP should sing. No. This whole COP should sing at the end of one of the plenaries. We're committed under the Sustainable Development Goals to not leave anyone behind. As a world, we've committed to leveling up, in effect. We've committed to keeping the world a safer place through trying to keep temperature to below 1.5. We've agreed to provide funding and resources in solidarity. But I think that some of the ideas of how we do that are best developing from the ground up, and they're not being heard literally in many of the hallways. They're not making their way through to decision makers who are still swayed too much by vested interest. I think yesterday there was a study done that actually the largest delegation at this COP is the fossil fuel industry, with over 500 delegates spread out in different badges. But if you put them all together, that's the single largest delegation, and they're invisible. But also invisible and hiding behind that are all the PR companies, the financing companies, the accountants, the lawyers. I'm a lawyer. I take responsibility for my profession to stand up and actually say, actually, we all have to reinvent our professions, reinvent our roles. It's not just about culture, it's also about power and abuse of power. And it's about flushing out our democracies, our decision-making from those who have knowingly actually brought us to the point of ecological collapse. And that's not something you can change just with culture, but I think an academy is a brilliant idea. In the negotiations process, someone should put that forward. Someone should submit in writing. You're allowed to, if you're the Welsh government, the Scottish government, you're allowed to go off anytime the offices are around there. I'm a bit lost geographically, and hand that in, and say, actually, what's needed to move the just transition preambular paragraph and the work of this committee forward is that. And that's been lacking. People have not thought that they can use this process to push for that learning, to push for best practice, to push for how they need to learn, encourage, learn from failures, learn from experiments, from pilots. So I would encourage each and every one of you to take what you've heard also and be an advocate for change, be an advocate for just transition, and start demanding more airtime from your local politicians, from your local communities, from your MPs and your governments. So thanks very much to ICLEI, the Scottish Government, and the Cities and Regions Hub for having us. I think Cities and Regions Day tomorrow, so we've got another big agenda to tackle, but thank you all very much for being a great audience and allowing us to run a bit over time. Thank you to my panel members as well, especially to Jim for stepping up at the last minute.
So